Good evening and welcome to another episode of The Review, where we discuss in depth the main stories of the day. Now tonight we hope to find out why the Sri Lankan authorities have departed from the World Health Organization's recommendation for the safe management of a dead body during the pandemic and brought in the mandatory policy of cremation. But first, let's take a look at this short film.
Sri Lanka's government policy that all people who die of COVID must be cremated, even in violation of their religious beliefs, is creating distress and outrage among the country's Muslim minority. As Islam states that the dead must be buried, protesters are taking to the streets and social media, and some are seeking to challenge the government's policy in court, saying it is violating their freedom of religion and fundamental rights. The Muslim Council of Britain has reacted by launching a legal challenge demanding an immediate reversal of the forced cremation policy. As the World Health Organization guidelines allows burial or cremation, some are asking why the Sri Lankan government has adopted this mandatory policy. Sri Lanka has a Buddhist majority, with Muslims making up about 9% of the population. The country has had more than 25,000 cases of COVID-19 and 124 deaths, including more than 50 Muslims who were cremated. Human rights activists say the cremation policy is part of an ongoing attack on the country's Muslim community. Why has the Sri Lankan authorities departed from the W.H.O.'s recommendation for the safe management of a dead body during the pandemic without any justification? Is it the case, as some Muslims and other groups believe, that ordinary Muslims are suffering retaliation for the Easter suicide bombings in churches and luxury hotels in April 2019? We find out tonight on The Review.
Now, in tonight's programme, we will be discussing Sri Lanka's mandatory cremation policy for those who have died from COVID-19. Now, this is an issue which raises very strong feelings, particularly amongst the Muslim community. Now, we have tried to bring together voices from both sides of the debate to discuss this important issue. Please bear in mind that the opinions you will hear are the personal opinions of those speaking and are not necessarily endorsed by the Islam Channel. Now, my guests tonight are experts from the legal sector, from medicine, the Muslim Council of Britain and representation from the Sri Lankan government. Welcome everybody and thank you so much for participating in tonight's discussion. Now, I'd like to start by introducing Sister Zara Muhammad, who is the Assistant Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain and leading on the MCB task force in response to the forced cremations in Sri Lanka. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you, my sister?
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you so much for having me on. Alhamdulillah, I'm well. Thank you. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, we're well. This is a very difficult, it's a very emotional, emotive issue for many Muslims around the world. Why do Muslims feel upset by this law, which is disallowing them to be able to bury their dead?
I mean, fundamentally, cremation goes against the Islamic faith. You know, it's completely prohibited. And even at the start of this pandemic, when Muslims here in the UK were faced with a similar issue, could they be cremated, you know, there was an absolute uproar. So it really goes to the heart of, you know, respect of burial rights and faith.
So a question I have, and I'm sure other people are asking, is why is it that the MCB, the Muslim Council of Britain, has really taken it upon themselves to launch this legal action?
That's a really important question. I mean, the Muslim Council of Britain works to achieve common good, a just and equal society for all, with, of course, a particular focus on Muslims here in the UK. And we have heard, you know, this issue from our affiliates, from our Muslim communities, from senior leaders. This is a global issue, but even here right in the UK, our affiliates and members have been affected. And, you know, the MCB have a really important role to ensure that where there is an injustice such as this, it's time sensitive, that we do, you know, we share that voice of concern. And so we have written to the Foreign Secretary, we've written to the Sri Lankan High Commission, and of course legal action is now another avenue we're exhausting because cremations are happening right now. And, you know, families are absolutely devastated, especially in the heart of this pandemic, you know, not being able to leave their loved ones in the way that they want to. So this is absolutely a critical issue for us as the MCB to address.
We'll come back to you very, very shortly. What I'd like to do is introduce the rest of the panel tonight. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kamal Abdul Nasser, who is a consultant physician at the Sherwood Forest NHS Foundation Trust in Mansfield, and he has worked in both the UK and Sri Lanka. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Now, for a perspective of Islamic relations in the UK and abroad, I'd like to also bring in Sir Iqbal Sakrani, who is a trained accountant and managing director of his business. He's dedicated much of his life improving the position of Muslims in British society, and he received a knighthood for his efforts in the community, including his work for race relations, charity, and a former advisor role to the Home Office. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you?
Wa alaikum assalam, Sajid. Alhamdulillah, I'm well. I hope and pray you're all keeping well as well.
Alhamdulillah. We also have with us tonight Mr. Abdul Halim, Councillor, Political and Commonwealth of the Sri Lanka High Commission. Now, Mr. Halim has studied law and took oaths as an attorney at law in the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka in 2006. Now, in 2009, he joined the Sri Lanka Foreign Service. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, brother.
And finally, I'd like to introduce Ifat Nawaz. She is a solicitor who has worked in both the public and private sectors for over 25 years. She was president of the Association of Muslim Lawyers from 2009 to 2016. Her work includes policy advice and community engagement on COVID-19 issues, as well as advising clients on human rights. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Now, I'd like to go back to Zara, just to really talk about this legal action. Now, the question I have for you is there a growing trend? Because it seems that Sri Lanka here really is alone when it comes to the procedure of the burial of Muslims. So out of 189 countries worldwide, they seem to be taking a very different stance when it comes to burial, where they're insisting that Muslims need to be cremated. Do you think this is going to be a growing trend, or are they really by themselves on this?
I mean, this is quite unprecedented for a state to be doing this kind of action. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is the implications is that Muslims are disproportionately affected. Sri Lanka is a very multi-ethnic and, religiously diverse community. So we don't see this as the trend. But what we do want to say and make very clear is that it's absolutely unacceptable, and that the state should be challenged if they're going to try and marginalize their minorities and, I guess, discriminate, especially on the grounds of religious belief.
OK. So what I'd like to actually go to is Dr. Kamal Abdul Nasser. Dr. Kamal, really at the root of this is a discussion around whether a dead body is still infectious. Now, what can you tell us from your medical background about the merit in the argument of the Sri Lankan government that we need to be cremating bodies?
Yes, this is a virus, and the virus cannot survive in a dead body. Virus needs a living cell to multiply. So if a person has got COVID-19, and he will have loads of virus multiplying every second into millions of copies, but once the patient is dead, the virus would stop multiplying. So the question is whether this virus that is there in the body, will it survive for some time? Yes, maybe for a few days. But there's enough scientific evidence that a dead body wouldn't transmit a disease to another person unless you go and touch the body, wash or kiss the body. So in Sri Lanka, we have given up washing the body. We don't want to even shroud the body. We just want a burial.
So
even we offer a double-layered body suit and then put into a sealed coffin. So it's very, very unlikely. It cannot transmit the virus after burial.
So there hasn't been really any clear direction or reasoning behind why there is a policy around cremation bodies, apart from one, which is around the fact that it could potentially affect the water supply. Is there any merit in that argument?
No, not at all. There are enough scientific evidence to say that water is not a source of infection. It's not a waterborne infection like hepatitis A. So it cannot be transmitted through water. And if you look at the so-called expert committee appointed by the health ministry has got a geologist who is not an expert in virology or medicine. And she keeps claiming that this virus could contaminate the groundwater. That's the basis. If you look at the Supreme Court case, all the medical experts said there's no evidence. We should wait for evidence. But this person insisted that this virus could be transmitted through water. So it's pseudoscience. It's not science at all.
OK, let me go to Mr. Abdul Halim. Mr. Abdul Halim, now you've heard from other panellists tonight, their reasoning around why they're taking legal action, the medical reasoning around why it doesn't make any sense, why bodies have to be cremated. I need to ask you a question here. Now, we had, I believe, the first Muslim died around about March 31st, which was, I believe, a few days after the Sri Lankan Ministry of Health initial guidelines, which actually mirrored the World Health Organization guidelines. The second death then took place around about April 1st. By that time, cremation was something which is being now enforced upon victims of COVID who are Muslim. And then very recently, we had a very difficult death of baby Sheikh, who's only 20 days old. And despite the remonstrating of the parents not to cremate their baby, the baby was forcibly cremated. Now, against a backdrop of discrimination and hate crimes in Sri Lanka against both the Muslim and the Christian communities, this really sounds like it's a continuation of victimization of minorities. Would you agree?
So, well, first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Islam Channel for conducting the Sri Lanka High Commission regarding the government of Sri Lanka's policy on the disposal of human remains of those deceased due to COVID-19. Well, I'm here, a representative of the government of Sri Lanka. I'm here on behalf of the government of Sri Lanka and the people of Sri Lanka to represent my country. Here, I reflect the policy of my government in this regard. So, first of all, I'm not an expert to elaborate further into the technicality of the case you mentioned. So rather, I would say the government of Sri Lanka, like most other countries, set up a COVID-19 committee that includes scientists, epidemiologists, and experienced health administrators. The current procedure adopted by the government of Sri Lanka regarding the human remains of COVID-19 related deaths is based on the recommendation by this committee guided by health-related principles. The government's decision to cremate all COVID-19 infected human remains emanates solely from such health guidelines. This policy remains subject to constant evaluation by the committee of experts based on scientific evidence.
Abdul Halim, thank you so much. I was hoping that we wouldn't have a scripted reply, but I completely appreciate. But as a human being, as a Muslim, as a father to 3 children, surely, I mean, from just an individual perspective, you must have a view on what is taking place. What is your personal view, if you were to give us that, rather than the view of the Sri Lankan government, if you please?
Yeah, I'm very honest with you. I'm telling that, it's very sensitive. You are asking, very emotional. But I'm a representative of the government, so my duty is to protect the interest of the people of Sri Lanka and the government of Sri Lanka. So I justify in that way. So then I'm not in a position to answer the emotional question you have raised at the moment, please.
Okay, so and then I follow up by saying over 189 countries around the world are following the World Health Organization's guideline. There are no countries, to my knowledge, you may correct me, that are currently cremating bodies as a forced policy. So why is it that Sri Lanka has taken this very bold move and saying that anybody must be cremated if they are a victim of COVID-19?
As you correctly mentioned, W.H.O guidelines is the guidelines.
Correct.
It has a persuasive value. We are sovereign government. We can accept the guidelines or we can deviate from the guidelines. This is not a mandatory guidelines to be followed by the government of Sri Lanka. So we totally depends on our expert committee's recommendation. So. This is my point of view.
Okay, so let me come to Sister Ifat Noor. Sister Ifat, the question I have is, do you think that the actions of the Sri Lankan authorities are infringing upon the human rights of their citizens and kind of a right to express their belief in their religion?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the sequence of events taken by the Sri Lankan government, on the 27th of March, they issue guidance in line with the World Health Organization, and that being followed globally by other countries. Yet a few days later, they change that guidelines completely without any explanation and say that anybody and everybody who dies from COVID has to be cremated. They've been challenged on that. Their expert evidence has been challenged. Experts within their own country disagree with the findings that the government is putting forward to support that change in policy, let alone international experts and World Health Organization experts who say that there is no evidence whatsoever that makes it necessary to cremate anybody who dies from this disease.
So sorry, just to come back to your point, and the representative, we've got Mr. Abdul Halim, who said that, look, it is an internal issue to Sri Lanka. The World Health Organization's guidelines are exactly that. They are guidelines. So are they not allowed to really have their own policy on how they wish to treat the remains or the victims who have passed away from COVID-19?
Well, we have a very important instrument in the country called a constitution, which gives fundamental rights to practice one's religion and faith, and that is protected by the constitution of the country. This departure is unjustified, so the government is acting in breach of its own constitution.
Okay, could you give us maybe some examples of how they are acting contrary to the constitution?
The whole practice of being able to bury one's deceased person in accordance with one's own religious beliefs is a constitutional right upheld by the Sri Lankan constitution. By disallowing that and in fact preventing that forcibly, the government is in breach of its own articles, which is what the challenges to the Supreme Court back in June was based upon, that the government is acting contrary and in breach of the articles and human rights that the Constitution bestows upon.
But then we can also say that these are extraordinary circumstances. We haven't seen a pandemic in our lifetime. So surely we have the Constitution, but there may be action that needs to be taken outside of that in order to safeguard your citizens.
Well, absolutely. Every case has to be looked at. But the issue here is that the overwhelming expert evidence internationally and nationally supports the position of the World Health Organization. To date, I don't believe there has been credible evidence advanced by the Sri Lankan government to justify its position, which is why it is really concerning that the Supreme Court decision on the 4th of December did not expand on any reason as to why it was dismissing petitions by 11 families of Muslim, Christian and Catholic faith who were saying that their articles and human rights were being breached from the Sri Lankan government. And that is why it is such a concern that this blatant disregard for the human rights, upheld in its own constitution, are being breached. And even the courts are not intervening and applying the rule of law, which they should be doing.
So if I go back to Mr. Abdul Halim. Abdul Halim, we're hearing that you're not really acting according to the Constitution. Human rights are being breached here. What would you say in response to those, those accusations being levelled against the government of Sri Lanka?
Well, in Chapter 3 of the Sri Lankan Constitution, enshrines the citizens and the people's fundamental rights. So the religious right is mentioned in Article 10 of the Constitution. It's enshrined the person's religious freedom. So, but basically, this freedom is allowed to exercise anyone in Sri Lanka is in the normal circumstances. But we are currently facing an unprecedented situation all over the world. So there may be a limitation. So if there is a national security or the concerning of public health in Sri Lanka, so then we cannot exercise wholly this religious freedom. For example, during this pandemic, the government has taken a decision to safeguard everyone in Sri Lanka. We are not targeting any ethnic groups or any minorities in Sri Lanka. This law is common for everyone.
So, Iqbal Sakrani, you're hearing here from Mr. Abdul Halim is saying that we're not targeting any ethnic groups at all. This is really an issue regarding the well-being of the citizens of Sri Lanka, what is best for them, especially in these very difficult times. What is your view on that? How would you describe, would you say that is correct, or would you say that this isn't really reflective of kind of the social backdrop of what's going on in Sri Lanka at the moment? With minority groups.
Yes, thank you. The entire world is going through the most difficult time of this pandemic. It's a fact. But as mentioned earlier, we have more than 180 countries in the world. And some of these countries whose geographical position is perhaps even more severe and serious than Sri Lanka. So how come that not a single country has as yet carried out this unjust and most atrocious action that is possible against a community? So I think we have as yet to have some explanation that makes sense. The scientific evidence as presented by our learned panelist also has been verified by the own senior virologist in Sri Lanka. And I believe that only last week the government set up an expert committee to look into once again the whole issue of whether there's any real threat of virus spreading. And I believe it's now in the Prime Minister's office. Their expert committee has once again totally rejected that there is no such element of concern that the virus can spread. So, let alone the scientific evidence which has now come in such a very clear-cut manner across all spectrums of the Sri Lankan society, providing documents by the top scientists, not just in Sri Lanka, but also from UK. In fact, our foreign ministry in the UK had offered to provide such evidence that would assist them to ensure that this information that they've given is incorrect. So if it is not to do with scientific evidence, then what is it? And that's the real question which people need to ask, that is it just a political issue which the government of Sri Lanka is carrying out a collective punishment on a community, right, for whatever political reasons? This, as per the international law and per the Constitution, is simply unacceptable.
So, Sir Iqbal, a question that some people may have legitimately is, why are we concerned about what the Sri Lankan government is doing within their own borders, within their own country? Why should this be of interest to us? And that's, I'm sure, a question that some people will have.
Sure. It's I think the basic ground of the concern that is raised, it's a human rights issue, right? Now, as a Muslim, of course, I have a duty. As a community, we have a duty that justice should prevail around the world. Wherever there's oppression, wherever there's injustice, we need to speak against it. And this is a clear example where a community is suffering. In fact, the Abrahamic faith, the Christian, the Muslims, and the Jewish community is suffering from this unjust action. Now, we also have a duty that if we allow such form of injustice, and it can be seen even oppression as well, right? Allow it to filter through, then what next? We can't let this dangerous precedent that is being established in Sri Lanka to be taken on by any other prior country around the world. So this is an action that really goes against the will of the international community, against international law, as we have been clearly informed, and against international conventions around the world, of which Sri Lanka is a member of the world community.
Sir Iqbal, Jazakallah khair. We'll be back shortly after this break. We'll be coming back to the panellists for further comments, and also to Mr. Abdul Halim, giving him his right to reply to all the points that have just been raised. Don't go anywhere. Join us after. Welcome back to The Review, dedicated to discussing Sri Lanka's policy on forced cremations of all deaths due to COVID-19. Now, we still have all of our guests with us. What I'd like to do is straight away go back to the representative from the Sri Lankan embassy, Mr. Abdul Halim. Abdul Halim, again, thank you so much for staying with us. Abdul Halim, the question I have for you is, you've heard the comments from all of the panellists who have said that, look, this goes against international convention, it goes against your own constitution, it goes against just human rights, and also it just seems to be focused on a minority group which has already faced so much persecution within Sri Lanka. What would you say to that? Do you understand the sentiments of the people, even the world community, who are looking at the actions right now, Sri Lanka, and thinking, why are you persecuting a minority during this time when so many countries around the world have no issues with burying the dead, especially those who are COVID-19 victims?
I'm telling the truth that we are not persecuting anyone in Sri Lanka, anybody in Sri Lanka. We just generalize the COVID pandemic law equal to everyone. And I would like to say all communities in Sri Lanka have last strikes peculiar to their respective cultures and religions, which are practiced under normal circumstances. However, all Sri Lankans have been compelled to part with their deceased loved ones without large gatherings, performing the final rites at short and simple ceremonies due to this unprecedented pandemic. There is understanding among most of them that during a pandemic, priority should be given to protect the living and prevent the spreading of the disease. As a country with modest resources, Sri Lanka is trying its best to ensure the protection of its citizens from the deadly virus. This is what I can say.
So, Abdul Halim, you can appreciate that the UN, even a resident coordinator of the UN within Sri Lanka, as well as Amnesty International, as well as other voices from the global community, have said what you're doing really is unfair and it needs to be rethought because it looks like and it smells like the persecution of a minority group. How would you respond to those organisations, or, I suppose, humanitarian organisations who are saying that, look, you really need to rethink this?
So, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, in a normal circumstances, we have protected all human rights of Sri Lankans. This is an unprecedented pandemic, so we need to take extra care of this disease spreading among communities. So we need to safeguard the spreading of the coronavirus among community. So that's why we have taken a uniform law to control this present pandemic.
So, Abdul Halim, I understand the Prime Minister was looking at a solution, which was to find burial space which could accommodate Muslims who were victims of COVID-19. What has been the result of, I suppose, that investigation by the Prime Minister and his office?
Well, this policy remains, as I said, subject to constant evaluation by the committee of experts based on the scientific evidence. So let's wait and see the committee's further recommendation in shortly. So if I get to know, then I'm very happy to share with you all.
So I suppose if I go back to Zara, as heading up this task force, what are your expectations? What do you want to see as a result of this international legal action that you've taken so far?
I mean, ultimately, we want the reversal of this policy, in short, and also a message to the international community that a state cannot marginalise and persecute its minorities based on the idea that this is an extenuating circumstance. So that's why MCB is committed to this action, and it's imperative that we do get that result.
And if I go back to Ifat and just kind of talk about the rights, again, we're hearing from the Sri Lankan representative, from the government, that again, these are very difficult circumstances. There is no pattern here. There is no victimization of a minority group, but they are looking at alternatives. I understand the Prime Minister has kind of asked to see if there is land which can be used to bury the victims of COVID-19 who are Muslim. And we also understand that the Maldives as well has suggested that they may be able to take the bodies and be able to bury them in their country. What would you say to that?
Unfortunately, what we're dealing with is a very ill-conceived policy adopted by the government, who is refusing to see, despite indications from world organizations like the United Nations, Amnesty International, humanitarian organizations, that this policy is flawed. It has no basis in science or in law. The government has not backtracked or even suspended cremations to allow it to undertake a review. Each cremation that has been forced is unlawful, and is a tragedy for the families affected. So if the government is pursuing alternatives, it should suspend all cremations until it has carried out that exercise. But what is happening? Every day, people are being cremated against their religious beliefs, against their families' consents, and that really has to stop. And I think exploring alternatives is frankly not good enough, and which is why the international rule of law is so important. When states act in haste and in error like this, they have to be held to account.
So if I go to Dr. Kamal, just going back to the whole issue around cremation. Now, again, these are unique situation that we're finding ourselves in, and I can't ask you to comment on maybe the kind of the religious aspect of this, but surely during this time, if a government feels that it needs to cremate a body, then surely they can just go ahead and do that, because they're just trying to make sure that it doesn't impact their country in any way, shape, or form. What would you say to that?
Yeah, if it's a real, say, pandemic where you cannot control this without cremating, yes, we Muslims in Sri Lanka would agree 100%. But if you look at the Ebola epidemic in the African countries, the death rate was 85%, and the infection rate was very, very high. Still, they allowed burial. So this, if you look at COVID-19, the death rate in Sri Lanka is less than 1%. And there's very clear scientific evidence to say that there's no waterborne infection, so the water wouldn't be a contaminating source. And if somebody comes and say the other day, like if you allow this pseudoscience to sort of make policies, then somebody can come and tell something else and keep on changing things without any evidence. This is not the sort of only thing. It can happen in the future with various other things if you allow these things to go on.
So Dr. Kamal, I suppose another question I have for you is there an overwhelming majority of medical professionals around the world who agree with you, or are there other medical professionals who would say they disagree with you? And there is a very real risk that should you bury a body of a COVID victim, there could be issues. There could be transmission. It could lead to kind of airborne infections, but as well as, the infection seeping into the water supply. Then surely there must be medical professionals that hold a contrary to you.
Internationally, I haven't seen any scientist or a medical professional, going against this policy of burial. But in Sri Lanka, there are some medical professionals who think, who not based on science, but they think, this could be a contamination. And then somebody in the committee once mentioned these bodies could be used by Muslims as a bioweapon. That's a serious statement. In Sri Lanka, the main body of the professional body of the community physicians, they are the people in preventive medicine. They put out their position statement last week. It's about 2 days ago. And they clearly said burial is permitted. And then there are so many other professional bodies. I think they're keeping silent. My request is they should talk. They know that it's against science. So I think they are not talking, they're just keeping silent. But one of the professional bodies, they are the most important group in prevention of COVID-19. They strongly came out and they have stated their position.
One of the final questions I have for you is, do you know of any viruses or infections which would necessitate the cremation of a body?
I would say no, because if you are to do that, it would be Ebola, because Ebola is such a deadly disease, you would cremate. But again, they managed to bury the bodies and they have not seen any waterborne infections or contamination happening through water. So I would say no.
So Iqbal, a question I have for you. Now, we heard that the Prime Minister is looking at a possible solution. We don't have any more information on that. We also understand the Maldives has very kindly said that they will take the bodies and bury them. What's your view on that? It seems that case solved.
No, in fact, sadly, that's not the right way to move forward. The Sri Lankan citizens, they are part and parcel of the Sri Lankan community, and they have a right to be buried in their own countries. And therefore, very rightly so, I think it's been rejected by the Muslim community for their bodies to be taken away from the country and into a foreign land. I mean, it's great for the Maldives to have offered this sort of facility where burial on the ground of pure human consciousness. But I think very rightly so, the Sri Lankan Muslim community have rejected that. That's not wrong. That's not right. But also the other areas that the other lands within the country where the Prime Minister, I think, made a statement that where more dry land can be found. Now, land has been offered. In fact, more than 50 to 60 acres have been offered by a single person. We're in a totally dry area, and yet government is still under discussion.
Okay, so Iqbal, if I just come back, let me get back to Abdul Halim. Abdul Halim, you've just heard from Iqbal Sakrani. He's saying that land has been offered by individuals even where the dead can be buried. Is there a reason for why those offers have not been taken up thus far?
So, as I said, I can repeat again. So, the policy remains subject to constant evaluation by the committee of experts. So based on the scientific evidence, we are waiting for the experts committee recommendation to do that.
Okay. The question I have, Abdul Halim, you've heard from all the panelists, and I think what is shocking from what I've read is on the 1st of December, the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka, they dismissed a fundamental rights petition, which means that it was closing any door for any further legal challenge, which doesn't really seem just and fair. But not only that, from what I read, is the Government Medical Officers Association and the Information and Communication Technology Agency agency, they put forward a concept proposal to your president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, which assigned and said that the Muslim population is the highest weightage of risk when determining the risk of spreading a virus. Now, do you not feel that for the vast majority, if they were to hear that there is an official report that is suggesting that Muslims are probably creating a higher risk of spreading that virus, do you not feel that that really borders on kind of a green light for almost ethnic cleansing?
Oh my God, I am totally against your statement. So we are not doing anything with regard to ethnic cleansing. So we are treating all people equally in Sri Lanka. You mentioned about the Supreme Court verdicts in this regard. I can say that no, Supreme Court of Sri Lanka is the high apex court in Sri Lanka. So I cannot comment on that decision, please.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Just going back to our panellists, so if I was to go back to Zara Mohammed, even if there was, we've heard that, really, it seems that the mind has been made up of the government. It doesn't really seem that they are really going to move from the position, and they feel rightly so because it's their land, it's their laws. They feel that they're not going against the constitution, even if they are. These are very unique times, which means that there is maybe a precedent for them to have a different policy. For either of you here, what would you say to Abdul Halim and the government here, who's saying that, look, really don't interfere in what we're doing because it really isn't anyone's business? So what is your view on that?
From my perspective, if I go first, is that, we have a global community. We have a United Nations, we have international law, a country that has signed up to international covenants on civil and political rights and other treaties cannot say this is our land and we can do as we see fit. Contrary to international experts' advice, World Health Organization's advice, that is why recourse has to be to the United Nations and external court beyond the highest court of the land. When irrational decisions are being made or unjustified decisions are being made, then those victims that suffer at the hands of such decisions have no recourse but to go outside their country and for them to be persuaded by the powers at the United Nations. And I think that's why this action is so important, because if a country start thinking that we can do as we wish within our borders, despite all the treaties that they've signed at the United Nations and at international levels, then it's a mockery of the rule of law. And that's a very dangerous precedent. And I think the global community will worry about any state that tries to operate in that matter.
So, Zara, a question I have for you then. I'm sure that you've established dialogue with the government as well. What discussions are taking place currently that maybe you can update us on?
So, as we're speaking, we have initiated, we've sent letters to the Foreign Secretary, of course, to the High Commission, letters to a number of MPs. I think what we're really looking at in the wider context of everything else that's going on is making sure that we as MCB continue to provide a very clear voice, and as if it alluded to, that we can't ignore this issue. This is really pertinent. It affects human rights. It's a global issue. But most importantly, for us as the MCB, we have Sri Lankan-based affiliates, and also we have a Muslim community who all agree that this fundamental principle of the right to bury your loved ones in the way that you see fit in view of your religious beliefs is so pertinent and so fundamental. And many may ask, why is the MCB getting involved in this? It's such an international issue. Well, it really just comes...
This is the question, because MCB is known for domestic issues, commenting on international issues, but never have, we've seen MCB take international legal action against a country before.
I mean, in terms of MCB's engagement, we have engaged previously in international human rights issues such as Kashmir, Palestine, more recently with the Uyghurs. But what we're seeing in this case is quite unprecedented for others to see of the MCB, is because of the nature and the gravity of what we're talking about, cremation and cremation happening now. And that is why the MCB has formed a task force. We've looked at this in terms of the legal aspect, the international affairs, the medical, the local community. And coming together, we now feel that this is the next available action to make this situation as serious as it needs to be for everybody, and also to encourage the Sri Lankan government to change their policy. So this is really just because of the gravity of the offence, and of course the fact that we do represent Sri Lankans here in the UK, and for the Muslim community all over the world, you know, cremation goes fundamentally against our faith and belief. And in a pandemic, we would hope that these fundamental things that are so important to all of us would be respected. And I think it really does come down to that human aspect. So we're going to play our part in this conversation and make sure that we do justice for those that are affected.
Well, I'm sure you can also understand Abdul Halim's point of view and the Sri Lankan government, that they are doing what is right for them. You know, we see the emotional aspect of it, but they're seeing it from more of a practical standpoint, what's good for the entire nation. Do you see that point of view?
I think that what we're looking at is objectivity. We're looking at this in the context of international law, of state practice, of what is right in terms of, you know, rights to citizens, human rights. So we're not looking at this as an emotional issue. That is important, but that is why we have a team of legal experts, health experts, and the World Health Organization themselves. So I think what we're seeing is this is not an issue of sovereignty. This is an issue of human rights and international justice.
OK, just going back to Sakrani, the question I have for you is, what are your expectations? What do you hope is going to be achieved through this dialogue? Do you feel that change will be made? Do you feel that the Sri Lankan government is going to come round to, you know, your point of view?
Well, it's not our point of view. I think they will come down to its own senses, what is fair and just. Sri Lankan government cannot remain in isolation on its own. Sri Lanka is a beautiful country which attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors every year for tourist industry. Yeah. They cannot just simply portray an image that anybody coming into the country, God forbid if they were to die out of COVID, they would be cremated. I mean, the message that would go out is pretty harmful to Sri Lankan's economy. Also, to bring into the context, the entire Muslim world is now raising this issue. It is, and this last week, the context that we've established in trying to find out what's happening, there's huge concern. And I'm sure there's a huge behind-the-scene diplomacy taking place, trying to convince Sri Lanka. Okay. But at the same time, if they do not, then I think this action that we're referring to is inevitable.
So just going back, Abdul Halim. Abdul Halim, the world is listening to you and watching you right now. You've obviously got the panelists who are very keen to find a resolution to this. What practical steps will the government Sri Lanka be taking, especially after hearing the sentiments of the people around the world on this very emotional issue? What practical steps will the government now be taking in order to find a solution to this specific issue?
So, well, as I earlier mentioned, you know, I repeat again. So we have taken decision in this regard is to protect all communities, irrespective of their religion, cultures, and so on. So still, all communities in Sri Lanka have last rights peculiar to their respective cultures and the religions, which are practiced under normal circumstances. But we are facing a very unprecedented situation all over the world. So this measure is to stop spreading or control the spreading of coronavirus.
Will your government, after this, will your government commit to reviewing the forced cremations policy? Is that a yes or a no?
But it is very difficult to say yes or no answer to these questions, because basically we depend on the expert committee recommendations. So then we can say after the recommendation is received from the expert committee in this regard.
Abdul Halim, thank you so much for joining us. It is appreciated, and of course, thank you to the High Commissioner of Sri Lanka as well for participating in the debate. Just a final thoughts from our guests, Zara Mohammed, Dr. Kamal Abdul Nasser, Iqbal Sakrani, Ifat Nawaz. If I can just go to each of you, just one line. What are you hoping to achieve from this show? What is it that ideally you want to see as a result of the discussion that's happened tonight?
So I think what we really want is the whole community, whatever faith they are, irrespective, to be aware of what is going on. This is a human rights violation, and we all need to speak. We need to message write to our representatives, members of parliament, put pressure on the Sri Lankan government, support the MCB, and you can check out our website to see what work we're doing.
Thank you, Zara.
And support our legal fund. Yeah.
Thank you, Zara. Go to Ifat.
Just for the Sri Lankan government to seriously review its policies and to halt the cremations until it makes its mind up. And until it does so, this action will be pursued. Dr.
Kamal?
Yes, I would expect the international professional bodies, mainly medical professional bodies, to try and convince the Sri Lankan government. Already the British Islamic Medical Association has appointed a committee and working on it, so they are actively involved in it. But I would ask others also to get involved in it.
And finally, Iqbal Sakrani.
Well, we have heard from our friend from the Sri Lankan High Commission that the expert committee has been set up and they're expecting to receive the report. I'm confident that report, without any reservation, make it absolutely clear that there is no concern in terms of virus spreading into it. And once the report comes in, then I think this will be the testament of the government to adhere to that expert report and bring an end to this huge tragedy, a calamity on the Muslim community and others, people who believe in burial.
I'd like to thank all of my guests tonight. We'll be returning soon with a new topic on the review. Until then, good evening and a happy and peaceful 2021.